Okay, some paradoxes of whistleblowing by Michael Davis. We'll start right here. By paradox, I mean an apparent, and in this case, real inconsistency between theory, that is our systematic understanding of whistleblowing, and the facts, what we actually know or think we know about whistleblowing. Okay, so let me just point out right now that, what page is this, 147? Okay, so on 149, starting at the bottom here, Davis goes through three paradoxes, and that's on, well, mainly 150 to here on 151. Okay, so the paradoxes that he's referring to here are specifically the paradoxes that he discusses on those pages. All right, he continues, what concerns me is not a few anomalies, the exceptions that test a rule, but a flood of exceptions that seem to swamp the rule. This paper has 4 parts. The first part states the standard theory of whistleblowing. Okay, so that is actually not the first thing he does. He has this on 148. But then the standard theory is here on 149. So he talks about that on 149. And then the paradoxes are paradoxes that arise with the standard theory. The second argues that the standard theory is paradoxical, that it is inconsistent with what we know about whistleblowers. Okay, so that's the 3 paradoxes part. The third part sketches what seems to me to be a less paradoxical theory of whistleblowing. Okay, so Davis is going to critique, or he's going to explain the standard theory, then he's going to criticize it. Then here on page 151, this is the other theory, a complicity theory of whistleblowing. And so this is his own theory, and so he's going to talk about this theory on 151 through 153. Okay, the third part sketches what seems to me to be a less paradoxical theory of whistleblowing. The fourth part tests the new theory against one classic case of whistleblowing, Roger Boscioli's testimony before the Presidential Commission investigating the Challenger disaster. Okay, so that's at the very end of the article. I use that case because the chief facts are both uncontroversial enough, that is the facts of this Roger Boscioli's whistleblowing case, are uncontroversial enough and well known enough to make detailed exposition unnecessary. For the same reason, I use that case to illustrate various claims about whistleblowing throughout the paper. Okay, so I've assigned to you the Boscioli case, it's just like 2 pages. So if you haven't read it yet, you should read it now, because as Davis says right here, he's going to be referring to it throughout this article. Okay, but moving on to the next section, justification in whistleblowing. The standard theory is not about whistleblowing as such, but about justified whistleblowing, and rightly so. Whether this or that is or is not whistleblowing is a question for lexicographers. That would be people who study lexicon, that is words basically. But that's not what Davis is. He's not concerned about the word itself, whistleblowing. For the rest of us, mere moral agents, the question is whether, if ever, is whistleblowing justified. So he's interested in this justification question. We may distinguish 3 related senses in which an act may be justified. First, an act may be something morality permits. Many acts, for example, eating fruit at lunch, are morally justified in this weak sense. They are, all things considered, morally all right, though some of the alternatives are morally all right too. Okay, so this would be something that I might call morally neutral. Eating fruit at lunch is neither morally right nor morally wrong. It's just, well, morally neutral. As you'll see, Davis is going to have maybe more to say about it than just something like eating fruit at lunch. But in any case, that's his first distinction, just morally allowable. Second, acts may be morally justified in a stronger sense. Not only is doing them morally all right, but doing anything else instead is morally wrong. These acts are morally required. Okay, so that would be kind of the normal sense of morally right and morally wrong. If an action is morally right, then we have an obligation to do it. We should do it. It's required. If an action is morally wrong, then we have an obligation to refrain from doing it. Not doing it is morally required. Third, some acts, though only morally justified in the weaker sense, that is, they're something that morality permits, are still required all things considered. That is, they are mandatory because of some non-moral consideration. They are rationally but not morally required. Okay, so actions which are prudential would fall into this category, rationally required, and maybe other actions as well. I shall be concerned here only with moral justification, that is, with what morality permits or requires. I shall have nothing to say about when other considerations, for example, individual prudence or social policy, make morally permissible, that is, morally allowable, whistleblowing something reason requires. Okay, so maybe sometimes a person might be legally required to blow the whistle, but that's not what Davis is going to be investigating. Most acts, though permitted or required by morality, need no justification. There is no reason to think them wrong. Their justification is too plain for words. Why then is whistleblowing so problematic that we need theories of its justification? What reason do we have to think whistleblowing might be morally wrong? Okay, so then Davis addresses that question on page 148, which I'm not going to, you of course should read it, but I'm going to skip here to 149, where Davis lays out the standard theory of whistleblowing. And actually, I have this for you. Okay, so for some reason, the way that this is formatted, in particular this part right here, isn't quite right. So that's why I put it here. This is just saying the same thing as what's in the PDF. The standard theory, according to the theory now more or less standard, such disloyalty, that is blowing the whistle, that refers back to the previous page, is morally permissible, that is morally allowable, when these three conditions are met. Just briefly, I mean, you should read them, of course, but the first one says the company is doing or going to do some harm. The second one, the person's supervisor has been notified of the harm but hasn't done anything. And then the third one, internally, the person has done everything possible, or at least all that can practically be done about whatever the harm is. Okay, so when these three conditions are met, then blowing the whistle is morally permissible, morally allowable. So if you only have these three conditions satisfied and you blow the whistle, that's okay. But you don't have to blow the whistle if only these three are satisfied. Whistleblowing is morally required, according to the standard theory, when in addition to those first three conditions, these two conditions are also satisfied. So, well, these two are S4, the person has good evidence of the harm, and S5, the person is justified in believing that reporting the issue publicly will prevent it. Okay, so if these two conditions, in addition to these three, are all met, they're all satisfied, then the person is morally required to blow the whistle. Okay, now let me just show you this. On the rest of page 149, Davis introduces and discusses these concepts. First, minimally decent Samaritanism versus good Samaritanism. Then he goes through morally excusable, morally allowable, and morally required. And then finally, he ends the page with this. The standard theory purports to state sufficient conditions, not necessary and sufficient conditions, a when, but not an only when. But these sufficient conditions are supposed to identify the central cases of morally justified whistleblowing. Okay, so then in the following section, he's going to argue that the standard theory fails to do this. It does not provide conditions that tell us when we have morally justified whistleblowing. Okay, so back to this. Why is whistleblowing morally required when these five conditions are met? According to the standard theory, whistleblowing is morally required when it is required at all, because people have a moral obligation to prevent serious harm to others if they can do so with little cost to themselves. Okay, so that's the moral principle that we're invoking here for why whistleblowing is morally required. In other words, whistleblowing meets all five conditions is a form of minimally decent Samaritanism, a doing of what morality requires rather than good Samaritanism, going well beyond the moral minimum. Okay, so a couple things here. One, you might reject this distinction between minimally decent Samaritanism, that is, doing what morality requires, and good Samaritanism, going beyond what morality requires. You might just think that if something is morally correct, then you have the obligation to do it, and that's the end of it. But sometimes we talk about what we have an obligation to do, and then going even beyond that obligation and doing more. So kind of the standard example here would be, for instance, if you see two people attacking each other, you have a moral obligation to call the police or to call for help. You might, however, go above and beyond that obligation and also try to intervene to prevent someone from being badly injured. So, I mean, of course, it depends if you're way bigger than the two people beating each other up, then maybe it's different. But let's say that you're putting yourself in harm's way by trying to protect someone from being attacked or from being harmed. So that would, we might think, be more than what you're morally required to do. So that would be getting involved in the altercation might be good Samaritanism, not just minimally decent Samaritanism. Okay, so then just the other thing I'll say about this is that this distinction between minimally decent Samaritanism and good Samaritanism is one that Davis is going to use when he's talking about the paradox of burden, which I think is the first. Yeah, so that's the first paradox he talks about. He bases that paradox, that is, that disconnect between the theory and the actual facts, on this distinction between minimally decent Samaritanism and good Samaritanism. Okay, so continuing. And so next, we're going to talk about these three concepts here. A number of writers have pointed out that the relation between the first three conditions and the full five does not seem to be that between the morally permissible and the morally required. If, for example, the whistleblower lacks evidence that would convince a reasonable, impartial observer of the threat in question, that is, if S4 has not been satisfied, her whistleblowing could not prevent harm. Since it could not prevent harm, her whistleblowing would not even be morally permissible. What could make morally permissible an attempt to help a stranger when the attempt will probably fail and the cost be high both to the would-be Samaritan and to those to whom she owes a competing obligation? The most that can be said for blowing the whistle, where only conditions S1 through S3 are met, seems to be that the whistleblower has an excuse when, without negligence, she acts on inadequate evidence. So if you blow the whistle only when these three conditions are satisfied, not S4 and S5, then Davis is saying, or he's suggesting, the whistleblowing is morally excusable, but that's it. It's not morally allowable or morally permissible. Something you shouldn't do, but if you do it without ill intent, then we'll excuse you for doing it. So for many writers, the standard view is that S1 through S5, when all five conditions are satisfied, those conditions state sufficient conditions for morally required whistleblowing, even though S1 through S3 do not state sufficient conditions for morally permissible whistleblowing, but at best for morally excusable whistleblowing. The standard theory is not a definition of whistleblowing or even of justified whistleblowing. The theory purports to state sufficient conditions, not necessary conditions, a when, but not an only when. Okay, so the idea there is that Davis is saying when S1 through S5 are satisfied, blowing the whistle is justified. However, there might be other situations where these five are not satisfied, but blowing the whistle would still be morally justified. So if these five conditions are satisfied, that's sufficient. That's good enough for justified whistleblowing. But that's not to say that there aren't other conditions that would also create the circumstances where the whistleblowing would be morally justified. Okay, so this is what he's saying right here. Kind of clarifies a detail about the theory. It's not a big criticism, however. These sufficient conditions are supposed to identify the central cases of morally justified whistleblowing. Okay, so saying this much is not a criticism of the standard theory. It's just saying that there might, in addition to the standard theory, be other theories as well of justified whistleblowing. However, he is going to, in the next section, criticize what's in this sentence, that it identifies the central cases of morally justified whistleblowing, and that is supposed to be a significant problem for the standard theory. Since a theory that did only that would be quite useful, we cannot object to the theory merely because it is incomplete in this way. Incomplete only in this way, the theory would be about as useful as theories of practical ethics ever are. However, all that said, now he's going to get into the paradoxes and argue that the theory really fails in more important ways.